I'm Joe Glenton, and welcome back to Warrior Nation, the only podcast offering a critical lens on militarism in the UK. In this, our fifth series, we'll be speaking to anti-militarists around the world to explore their unique motivations, tactics, and approaches. Their expertise includes everything from opposing the arms trade and militarised borders to countering military recruiting and supporting war resistors. With UK government support for continuing wars in Ukraine and elsewhere, and now the bombing of Gaza, platforming and enabling anti-militarist discourse is vital. It follows that these conversations are more important than ever. If you enjoy what we produce and would like to support us to make more of it, then you can help us keep making Warrior Nation for as little as £2 a month via our Patreon, or you can support us through our donation page. And if you'd like to keep up to date with our work, you can sign up for our free monthly newsletter. Mohammed Ghalayini is a Palestinian from Gaza living in the UK since 2004. In his day job, he is an atmospheric scientist working on air pollution policy. Mohammed is also a translator and writes poetry, mostly political. He returned from Gaza in December 2023, having lived through the Israeli assault, and since then has been working on a project gathering testimonies of Gazans and supporting them with cash assistance for food security projects.
Last year, I went home to Gaza in September. On October 7, I was on my way to harvest olives when we saw the rockets and missiles and learned the news. Can I speak up for our right as an occupied people to fight back, to resist, to break down our prison walls, while also holding a space for innocents killed in Israel? To me, it is clear, but somehow, to the world, it is one or the other, victims or killers, and never the two shall be one. I went back home, we packed our emergency bags, and I left with Mama and Sundus, thinking we'd be back in 2 weeks. In a Palestinian story as old as 1948, here we are now, out of Gaza, holding keys to a house that is now rubble. We watch TikToks of Israeli soldiers cooking up a storm while trashing our homes. I hold a twisted hope that I maybe will see mine on the next video. People in Gaza record Instagram reels of the devastation, surveying what's left of our city streets. More TikToks of Israeli soldiers dancing, doing thirst traps to the background of Merkava tanks on their genocide breaks. We see YouTube shorts of our children navigating a war zone, fighting against the fear, cold, and hunger. Back on Instagram, there's a reel showing Mama's apartment block half destroyed. Ever stoic, she jokes, well, at least the looters got some use out of our things.
Welcome back to the Forces Watch podcast. We have had many, and correctly, many pro-Palestinian voices on our podcast over the years, but I believe this is the first time we've had an actual Palestinian, and it's particularly of moment that he is one who has seen the early months of what's been going on in Gaza over the last in the current, however you want to frame it, war, occupation, genocide. We can discuss the semantics of it. But we're very proud to be joined, and I'm going to do my very best. We've just had this discussion off camera by Mohammed Ghalayini, who is a Palestinian based in the UK, a translator, a poet, which we'll get to as well, a scientist, and we're particularly happy to welcome you onto Warrior Nation today.
It's really good to be with you here today, Joe. Thank you for inviting me, and I guess, to the audiences. I'm happy to be, speaking to you.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. I just want, there's a lot, you are a lot of things. You do many things, you have many identities. Could you just give us a breakdown about you, about your relationship to Palestine and Gaza?
Of course, yeah. Well, I guess, let's start with my relationship to Palestine and Gaza, I guess. So I'm a Palestinian who was born outside Gaza. As I said in the poem, I was born in Saudi Arabia in '79. My parents, my mother was from Gaza, but my father, he was a refugee outside Gaza, and they met at university. And so I didn't automatically have the right to return to Palestine myself when I was born, hence the poem being registered with the Israeli authorities, which gave me that right. Yeah, I spent half my life between the UK and Gaza until 2004. And then in 2004, I actually, I guess, made the decision to come pursue. I came to study in the UK, and again, like with many decisions, it was meant to be, a 5 year period. But then the situation, I studied environmental science, and then, the first endpoint of, okay, do I go home now? Because like what many Palestinians, many in the diaspora, from any diaspora, really want is to kind of make a life in their where they're originally from. And so I was like, okay, 2007, shall I go home now? Oh shit, no, the situation's really bad. Okay, let's stay for a little bit longer. So I stayed, and I studied some more. I enrolled in a PhD program in atmospheric science. So that's kind of my main professional identity, I guess you could say. I'm an atmospheric scientist. I work uh, on air quality policy in the UK. And then, yeah, things that I do on the side, I translate short stories from Arabic to English, with mostly working with an organization called Comma Press, who shout out to Comma Press. They've got some really good books, quite a few of them on Gaza and Palestine, but also on they recently published a book called Egypt Plus 100 that I contributed to. Sorry, sorry, but I think they really deserve a shout out because they try and get voices from places that are marginalized. And they also did like a really good one called Iraq Plus 100 as well, which I wasn't part of. So, but yeah, so those are like my profession, my identities. Poetry, I kind of do it as I guess as an outlet, and I like to just, as someone who gets involved in advocating for Palestine, you end up doing different things because I guess perhaps, as I understand, Joe, that I would imagine that you're perhaps someone who's in a sort of campaigning role at Forces Watch, and you kind of end up having many different hats. So at the moment, for example, I've just come out of a meeting where we're producing a show, a cabaret show called Gaza Nights in Manchester. And yeah, and I've just been talking about kind of creative production and how to curate a show, and how to bring that to fruition. So it's quite, just from a personal point of view, it's quite nice to kind of be able to do many different things because it keeps life kind of interesting. And but yeah, you have to be good at managing your time.
It's always a juggling act, right? That's absolutely true. And you do, yeah. It sounds like you have a lot on and a lot of very interesting things on. We've seen. I have no doubt you've seen, and I obviously want to be sensitive about anything which may be affecting for you. But we saw the face of high power politics as it relates to Palestine. We saw Netanyahu in the Senate applauded, and that is the kind of the register and the tone of high power politics. In my reading, looking at it over the last 9 months, you were in Gaza on the 7th. We were talking about that before. When I'm running a podcast, when I'm having a conversation, I always want to try and come down to the level of the real people, not the high power politics. We have to talk about the high power politics, but the real people. Can you talk to us about that moment and the events of that time a little bit?
At the moment of being in Gaza on October 7th and just being in Gaza, of course. God, I guess like maybe it helps to actually just rewind a couple of weeks because Gaza, I guess for starters, there's almost like and I know this is not what you're going for, but like there's a misconception, unfortunately, that the history of the Middle East began on October 7th, when it didn't. So a few weeks before October 7th, I traveled home with my sister. We had to travel to Egypt because the Israelis and the Egyptians are partners actually in this besiegement of Gaza. They both play a role. And you have to travel across the Sinai, which is a military zone, and we can talk about that a bit more as later on maybe. And then so we got to Gaza. Gaza, despite being besieged, people in Gaza are so resilient, so adaptable. You make something out of what you have. Necessity being like the mother of invention. And despite the fact that Gaza, 2.3 million people in an area, I guess the size of, I don't know, Greater Manchester or Leeds and Bradford maybe, still has so much to offer, but it's still an area that has, if we're talking about, something that people can perceive, it's on the Mediterranean Sea. It's heavily agricultural in the sense that probably like 20 to 30% of the land there is agricultural land, but it's also very heavily populated. So the last time I'd been in Gaza before this trip was a couple of years prior, and then 2019. And every year you can visibly see the towns joining up, and like the lack of space between the towns, and also kind of urban sprawl encroaching on onto the agricultural land. So that's probably like an important feature. And then another important feature or something to think about when it comes to Gaza is, I guess, how young the population is. I don't have, I should have a figure, but it's a very, I guess like one of, as an agrarian-ish society, as a society that has its roots in that, having big families has been something that in more and more in the culture, somewhat in the culture, because you have a bigger family. That means that you can tend the land more and provide for yourselves more. So it's quite a young focused society. But there's massive unemployment, both in people who are young, but generally there's like close to 70 or 80% unemployment. And so each person that's working will be supporting upwards of 20 or 30 people. And like one of the things that really touch you, that you see on the streets, is if you say stopped at traffic lights, and I think it's something that happens here, but it's mostly people who are much older. But in Gaza, you have children who are either begging at traffic lights or, hawking goods or something like that. So, it's a place of quite high inequality and poverty. And that's a result of it being besieged and occupied. But also, just to point out, it's always been a place of like hope and defiance as well. Gaza just wants to live. Like that's Palestine just wants to live. That is it.
Yeah.
I hope so. I guess I feel like that's kind of like a portrait of Gaza, but I've not really mentioned the occupation that much, because like the Israelis, Gaza just wants to live, but it's been surrounded by a electrical fence that closes it off on all points. And then on the sea front, you cannot go more than 6 miles out. So my friends who work in the fishing industry, like they have a really hard time having to contend with Israeli shipping boats shooting at them if they go more than the distance they should. So Israel controls everything that comes into and goes out of Gaza, either them or the Egyptians. Obviously, it's not total control, but I think because there's been there have been smuggling tunnels, and that's been I guess the subversive or disruptive element. So I guess is that enough of a portrait? Is there anything to add?
It's perfect. It's fantastic. Okay. Yeah. It's very, very good.
Thank you.
Maybe it would be good. I think if you're British, for example, and particularly if you're white, you're not from a diaspora, you're just British in the standard sense, it's possible to be insulated from history, and a lot of people are. And I think that was certainly the case for me for many years. And then I went out into the world, and I realized, particularly I realized that the nature of Britain's relationship with the world, and the fact that history in places in the Middle East, in places in Central Asia, all around the world, even as close as Ireland,
Hmm.
for people who have been occupied, history is now, it's real, and it's
Yeah.
lived constantly. And that certainly seems to be the case for me, for Gaza. And when I've spoken to Palestinians and Palestinian diaspora people, history is very apparent. I recently went back to the 100 Years War on Palestine, which I read many years ago, a fantastic book, and the degree of British sponsorship and direct training and provision of arms to the what would become the Israeli state, the Zionist militias, is incredible. Even to reread it, I'm like, wow, look at how this was being built many years ago. Could we talk a little bit? Can you just reflect on the history, on that history that I've touched on there?
Oh, 100%. I think you make a very good point generally about history being lived still in places like Palestine, but also in many parts of the African continent, and and even like South Asia, India, and Pakistan and others, because we are living we're living in a post-colonial world, but it's not. That doesn't mean it's a liberated world. It's a world that's suffering from still has like the remnants and vestiges of colonial power structures in different ways that like wield influence. So yeah, but with Palestine, let's let's focus. With Palestine, you could say that one of the significant starting points for Palestine was 1917 and a document called the Balfour Declaration, where the then British Foreign Minister, Arthur Balfour, wrote a letter, a simple letter to the Arthur Balfour wrote like a simple letter to the Zionist movement. There was for 20 years prior, there'd been a collective of Jewish people who lived in I guess the Jewish diaspora, who formed a Zionist movement that set its aim of creating a national homeland for the Israelis, and they eventually convinced the British, sorry, creating a national homeland for Jewish people, and they eventually convinced the British government to promise them the land of Palestine. So in other back channel movements, and Lawrence of Arabia, of kind of mystical fame, they said to Lawrence of Arabia, they said, he'd been speaking to like our other Arab leaders and said, we're going to guarantee uh, liberation and freedom from colonialism for the Arab people, but yeah, that was the situation. They promised Palestine to the Zionist movement, and that set the ball rolling. There was, I guess, increased immigration to Palestine of like the Jewish diaspora, and they started occupying land, forming communities, and look, I'm gonna say now, like in and of itself, if if you want to take that immigration just as in and of itself, that's not like to me a bad thing. I think I don't believe in a world of nations and strict borders. I believe in a world where people do have the right and the freedom to uh, live where they want, so long as they don't then, you know, take over and colonize and dominate. You have like the pre-Israeli state, the issue of building more and more kind of population centers, building military capability, uh, getting support from the British uh, state at the time, the mandate, but at the same time having a tension with them. They also conducted attacks against Israeli forces, because it wasn't like one monolithic movement. But ultimately, the end result was that the British had a mandate over Palestine, promised it to the Zionist movement, supported the Zionist movement, and then withdrew in 1947, withdrew their forces without coordinating. And I guess, like, you could say, with the knowledge that the Zionist movement was the one that they supported, built up, dominated, the Arab states around Palestine were kind of in hock, in a sense, with the Israelis as well. The army leaders of the Arab states were all in some ways, well, in Jordan anyway, they were all trained and staffed by former British officers. The Egyptians kind of tried to come to the aid of Palestinians, and there wasn't really, in terms of like Palestinian resistance, it wasn't something that was that strong. It was just overpowered by a much superior force that had been supported by the British. And then we had, like, so 1948, 700,000 Palestinians, my grandparents on my father's side amongst them, having to leave different places. They came from Jaffa, which is 50, 60 kilometers up the coast from Gaza. They all had to leave, some by boat. One of my grandfathers almost drowned because he fell off the boat while he was going up to fetch his brother. And so that was the first Palestinian dispossession. That was the beginning of the problem that we have today, because Israel and its displacement and dispossession of Palestinians is the problem.
If you enjoy what we produce and would like to support us to make more of it, then you can help us keep making Warrior Nation for as little as £2 a month via our Patreon, or you can support us through our donation page. And if you'd like to keep up to date with our work, you can sign up for our free monthly newsletter. See the show notes for more details. You talked about the idea that a post-colonial world, and like some people will read that as being it's all the empire's over. Of course, we know that's not true. We mean something very specific when we say that, because the relationships endure. And now we talk about the arming, or the role the British had in arming and shaping the Zionist movement of the day. And then we look now, there is a debate still in Parliament now currently about the continued reality of British militarism, its role in supplying the occupying forces there.
Absolutely. And I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I think also it's presented in a way in Parliament and in the media as the British role in arming Israel as actually being minor, when it's not minor at all. And I think there's what you'd call, I guess, just smoke and mirrors that are used to make it seem less than it is, when, if you consider that, just one example of how important the British role is, the F-35 jets that are used near daily to bombard Gaza, our home, my apartment block, would have been brought down by a bomb from an F-35 jet or an F-16. Those jets are the fuselage for them, or an important part of the fuselage, is only made by BAE Systems near Blackburn. Yeah. So when you have officials and supporters of, I guess, say, arms sales to Israel saying that that the UK doesn't actually contribute that much to arms to Israel. No, they contribute some very, very important, vital equipment. That's one.
So you've talked there. It's very important to talk about the reality of the enduring, decades-long, century-long or more relationship, particularly in terms of arms, between Britain and Israel. Or the Zionist movement, which formed the nucleus of what we now know as Israel. And you talked about the use of F-35s, British military equipment used to bring down entire apartment blocks, including probably your own. And I want to, this also bears on your background as well. You work in environmental sciences, you're a scholar. And I wanted to talk, at Forces Watch, we talk a lot about this relationship, which is understudied or underspoken about between war and militarism and the environment. And we talk about it in terms of Iraq, we talk about it in terms of Afghanistan, also the impact of industries at home. But there has been some good reportage about the impacts. There has to be an impact. It's a small place being intensively bombarded, Gaza. there has to be a consideration somewhere about the impact that all these munitions, all this military hardware, and I've worked with some of this stuff in Afghanistan, white phosphorus and things like that. I'm talking about. It's awful, toxic, deadly stuff. What for you are the implications with your professional background of the environmental implications for Gaza when this is, we hope, over sooner rather than later?
I think we could probably split that up into two distinct themes in some sense, because part of it is about facts on the ground, the way that land is used, and this spans beyond Gaza into the West Bank as well. So, for example, the fact that that Israeli settlements that are illegal under international law, that the ICJ recently ruled upon as illegal, and we all have known for decades that they're illegal, take up close to 20 or 30% of the land of the West Bank that should be part of the future Palestinian state. They control access to the land, but also access to the water, and the fact that so you have like an inequality in the distribution of the distribution of environmental resources that then people rely on to produce crops, to drink. To drink. People have water shortages in the West Bank as well as in Gaza. So that's one part, and then the other part is, you could say, around the acute impacts of intense military activity in an urban area. Particularly, I think Gaza is a particularly intense example, because first of all, you have an insane amount of destruction of buildings, of infrastructure, and from let's just start on this from firstly from what that infrastructure means in terms of how if you ruin sewage infrastructure and water infrastructure, that means that you have further pollution of groundwater. That means people will suffer more from waterborne diseases, and you have a very immediate feedback line in terms of people falling ill. And already we're seeing a massive rise in waterborne diseases. We're seeing people suffering from polio for the first time in Gaza. Gaza is a place, most countries in the Arab world have like quite high vaccination rates. People get vaccinated, and now polio is back. So that's one element of the immediate, the acute risk, I guess, from the military activity. And then you have, I'll touch a little bit upon my area. You have the air pollution impact, where you have buildings that have become rubble. All that rubble is fine particles that people will be breathing in. I'm not even going towards the military origin contamination, which is that's like a whole area of itself that I don't think we could go into it, because it's there's so many uncertainties in it. But within that uncertainty, we know that that mix of heavy metal dust, some explosive remnants. We know the profiles, the toxicological profiles of various of the explosives, and those remnants will be stuff that people will be breathing in. And in order to actually quantify to get like an actual measure of the harm, we'd need to do like a very long-term study on people to kind of to see the harm. Now, that said, though, and I'm glad you mentioned Iraq, Afghanistan, and I'll add one to the mix, Vietnam. We know that in situations where there have been intense military operations, civilians on the ground have suffered in terms of their long-term health. There have been cases of increased, birth defects and genetic diseases, rises in cancers. So that's, that's one aspect. And then thinking of examples, other examples in Iraq, for example, to do with military burn pits and the fact that you've got a military operation. Its primary objective is not to protect the environment. Its primary objective is to achieve military objectives of occupation of whatever the military objective is. And then these burn pits, we've already seen like health reports on returning troops in the US, for example, who've identified similar symptoms to, I think, the first responders in 9/11 when it comes to like respiratory illnesses and the like. And the same would apply to civilians there. And I guess finally, I mentioned Vietnam and the use of the Agent Orange herbicides that were used to strip the foliage back by the US troops. Now, interesting link here. It turns out that the first instance of the use of herbicides in conflict like that was actually the British in
I believe it was Malaya. I'm aware of this as well.
Right.
That Agent Orange. A lot of the things that were done in Vietnam were kind of trialed by the good old British in Malaya.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Like, ultimately, when you have like militarism and the military, when you talk about militarism, I think militarism. I'd be interested in your take on this, because I think that militarism in and of itself it's not just something that like a community wakes up one morning and decides, you know what, we're going to be militaristic. No, I think it's something that kind of develops out of, I guess, what the drivers of economic forces and developments are in a certain place, and you have the for example, the British Empire, that obviously a massive part of it exerting its control was through military means. The new empire post Second World War was the US, and and then you had Eisenhower coining the phrase military industrial complex, and the fact that you had this kind of almost intermarriage between the forces of capitalism and the military. So military manufacturers connected to that have capitalist driver incentive, then connected to foreign policy that then leads to a culture of militarism, and I'd say there's a large part of what we're seeing in Palestine now that's connected to that, because if you consider, for example, that the Israeli military establishment, and by that I mean their army, but also they have a massive military industry, and that prides itself, and I'm sure you've probably had people from maybe campaigns against the arms trade or other organizations who can tell you more, but they pride themselves on selling battle tested in Gaza, in the West Bank, equipment, be it targeting software, be it types of explosive charges, be it drones, but also those first line combat. There's also massive like systems of population control that the Israeli security establishment develops with partners like HP. So all these systems that are used to control Palestinians right now will at some point, they're profiting corporations that partake in this militarism, but at some point they're going to be used in controlling populations here and in places in between as well. And that's kind of something that when you talk to, I guess, people in the UK, and they say sometimes you'll talk as part of campaigning, you'll go do some outreach and try and speak to people and say, it's Palestine, it's halfway across the world. Why should I care? And I'm like, well, this is why you should care, because it might not affect you today, but it will affect you tomorrow. And this is why you should care. First, they came for the Palestinians. If you don't stand up now, that it will be coming for you after that.
100%. It's very interesting what you say there. I also know that Israel, one of the things that Israel is famous for producing is surveillance equipment, which will definitely, they might not be bombing Leeds yet, but the surveillance equipment is popular and is turning a good bottom line for CEOs of Israeli arms firms. At least I think it's very interesting when we talk about militarism, it is exactly what you're talking about. But I think there's another way of understanding militarism, which we talk about at Forces Watch, where part of what is required is that war is normalized, that war and its processes and its institutions, whether corporate or state, are normalized and they're unquestionable. The war is unquestionable. It just happens. And we need to make weapons, and we need to have armies, and they need to be astonishingly expensive. Because that's just how the world is. And it's this idea of like normalizing. And that's part of what it's a function. It's a necessary ingredient in militarism that war must appear normal rather than, I mean, I've seen it, you've seen it. It's completely deranged. It's a completely deranged and a completely unnecessary process. But part of what militarism does is normalize it and make it kind of acceptable, and frames it also as something that happens over there. It doesn't really affect us. It's over there. It's what other people do.
Some people might have seen Eylon Levy. He's a spokesperson for the Israeli government, or was a spokesperson for the Israeli government until he butted horns with David Cameron on Twitter and was fired. But Eylon Levy, in an interview, I think with Krishnan Guru-Murthy and many others, when he'd be asked about the horrificness of Palestinian death in Gaza, also in the West Bank, he'd say, war is awful, but this is what you have to do in war. And he'd like come out with this kind of crocodile tears kind of face. Krishnan, war is awful. We don't want war. War was forced upon us. But I think the thing that then, the missing link there is that actually war is never forced upon an occupying power. An occupying power, or a power that goes to war beyond its borders, is bringing war to the people that it is whose territory it is attacking, and then that results in a reaction. And so like the Israeli occupation, beginning with dispossession of Palestinians in 1948, going through the 1967 takeover of the West Bank, Gaza, the Sinai, and the Golan Heights, which at the moment like media are reporting as if it's part of Israel without even questioning the fact that it's actually occupied territory. Those acts of occupation, be it that or the Iraq War or whatever, are what then brings a response and a reaction, and it creates an environment where, I mean, I'm genuinely fearful for how what the blowback will be from the war in Gaza recently for people around the world whose governments have been complicit. And but yeah, and the normalization of war is one of the first links in the chain to bring about that blowback, and we just don't talk about it enough because of how normalized war is. And it's like, oh yes, we live in this world where we have to be a strong dog. We have to like flex our muscles, and you can talk about it on the level of standard military equipment. You can also talk about it on the level of nuclear war and deterrence, and something that it's just when you really like think about it, it's kind of insane. And I think it is. I would say that it's like a period in history where where it's really kind of at just a level that's almost unprecedented because of like the proportion of government spending on militarism and war.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I also think there's always an inference there, and people talk about the British Empire in this way, but also that I mean, what they're trying to say is that war and occupation are kind of functions of human nature. It's just like what people are like, and that uh, we almost absent-mindedly, accidentally took over all these countries, and actually, like these things are deliberate programs. You don't accidentally invade Iraq. It's not like you trip over in the corridor, you know, you don't mobilize an entire army. In fact, several entire armies accidentally or because of it's a reflex, like a natural reflex. These are very deliberate programs which are thought about on an intellectual level and planned. So it's always strange to me now, years after having been in the army and having become much more conscious, I find those arguments, they're still very common, but they're just unutterably bizarre.
Yeah, that's actually interesting because it doesn't happen by accident. It comes through having, I guess, methods, doctrines, standard practices where, okay, we are going to project our power this way, and then if that power is threatened, because I don't want to be like, gloss over the fact that obviously there are when it comes to international affairs, there will be tensions,
Mhm.
but it's often been that the solution when it comes to mostly Western militaries has been interventionism when other options are not, like other options, like, for example, really strengthening the UN and actually making UN processes that have now in Gaza, particularly, just been like the UN and this international rules-based order of which they talk. But ultimately, it's about for rules that protect Western military interests and Western commercial interests and their allies over all others. Strengthening this rules-based order so everyone's disincentivized from breaking it, and you actually have systems of international governance that work. It is possible. It is completely within the gift of our society, but there are choices that are being made against that, and that's the problem.
I have to agree. We're going to start to round up to get onto the final questions.
Yeah.
And I suppose it relates to what you've just said. Western politicians love to talk about the rules-based international order, about the institutions, the mechanisms, the courts, the ICJs and the ICCs. And what we've seen certainly in the last 9 months, and even before that, I would argue, is that those Western institutions and they are Western institutions. That it's through the Western lens which they operate. I think that case could be made, but they look hollow. They look hollow and empty and pretty useless. I mean, it's positive to see the ICJ, ICC making some of the declarations it's made, but the problem is enforcement, obviously. And when we look at that, if we take that as the state of play, and we look at the struggle of the Palestinian people, where do we go? What do we do? What can we even begin to imagine what a just peace would look like for those people?
So, I don't think I have an answer that's fully within the international rules-based order, because I think at the moment that system is trying to go towards, I guess, solutions that ultimately mean the continued submission of the Palestinians and a perpetuation, therefore, of the status quo. And I can go into a bit of that. There's talk of a Palestinian state on Gaza and the West Bank, but currently, as I said, 20% of the area of the West Bank is taken up by Israeli settlements and security structures. And as now is 20% of Gaza or more, because they've created buffer zones all over the Gaza Strip that can divide north from south, and like a 2 kilometer, 1 to 2 kilometer buffer all along the border. So that's, like a 20 kilometer almost, square swathe that's gone, maybe more. Sorry, 80 kilometer. Anyway, figures. So where we need to go really is, first of all, ending the occupation, ending the Israeli occupation. And what that means is no Israeli troops in Gaza, freedom of movement for people in Gaza and the West Bank. So also like no Israeli military presence in Gaza and the West Bank. We have a lot of Israeli settlements in the West Bank. There will have to be some sort of determination for them to live as Palestinian citizens or to leave. That's the choice that they should have. So that's what I would see as the bare minimum solution. An end of the occupation, a proper Palestinian state that functions with full sovereignty without control from Israel, and in Gaza and the West Bank, and some sort of solution for settlers, and finally reparations for Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank and refugees. So that, as I said, the bare minimum. Now, you'll recall that I said, oh, we have the occupation. Sorry, like I come from Yafa. My grandparents' family are from Yafa, and there's millions of Palestinians who have homes or ancestral homes in what is now Israel. And the next step has to be, how do you then create something that in some ways fixes that historical injustice? Because at the moment, the present state of Israel is a settler colonial state that has taken land that does not belong to it and settled it with people who don't, and pushed out the people that used to live there. And I think we need, I mean, like ultimately, and this will take much more time, but you need some way to bring the two together. I think look, ultimately they call it maximalist, but my ideal solution is a one-state solution, but that would take a lot of time and transition from a two-state solution to some sort of confederate one-state solution where everyone had, equal land rights or something like that, or equal rights of movement and residency, to make sure that you correct the past wrongs and allow refugees, if they wanted to return, or if not, then they get reparations. So yeah, that's to me what a just peace looks like. And sorry if I was a bit labored. Where we go to get it really is to kind of decouple this peace process from the mostly American and Israeli meddling, which is not in the interests of a just peace and is in the interests of domination. That's what needs to happen. And we need more, better, more just players to come in. And by that, I don't mean Egypt. I don't mean the UAE. I'm not sure who those players will be, but we need better mediators, because the countries that surround Gaza, surround Palestine, and some of the countries in the wider region are now very kind of they're in themselves players in the military-industrial complex. And if you look at the war in Yemen, for example, and how arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE drove that war. If you look at Sudan, the ethnic cleansing and genocide that's happening there, and how, again, UAE military influence is there. There has been evidence of Emirati troops on the ground. Passports were found, and human rights organizations have been talking about it for a while, but we've just seen the first evidence of that. So ultimately, I guess it's kind of decoupling the mediation of a solution from those that are involved in this military, industrial, political complex, and away from a militaristic domination worldview and towards one that allows the agency of the people that are actually on the land. I mean, we have to also seize that agency. And I think, in a sense, we never really talked about the period I was in Gaza, but like in a sense, the Hamas attack on October 7th was in a way part of seizing that agency. I think I say it in my poem, how, can I stand up for our right to resist while at the same time holding space for innocents killed? Yes. I mean, I think in the end we had we as an occupied people had the right to make that attack. I don't stand by everything that's happened as a result of it. I'm not a psychopath who likes to see people killed. Israel does not have the right to operate for Gaza in 10 months, killing. I mean, the official death toll is 40,000, but we're looking at, from doctors and public health officials who are saying it's probably close to 100, 200,000 even. And you're talking about like 10% of the population now. So I spent 2 months in Gaza under the Israeli bombs, living with, my family, my cousins, my people, the Israeli assault that can only be described as genocidal. I saw how our access to water, I suffered from the cutting of our access to water, and how, things that you take for granted in the UK, in a country that is in the 21st century, like running water or electricity at the switch of a button, internet just in your house or on your phone, all of those things, I saw them go. And then I saw worse. I diced, you could say I diced with death, in the sense that, every journey was a risk, because you did not know where the next bomb would fall and whether that bomb would take you. I walked into my aunt's house once, and 5 minutes after I walked in, no, not even 5 minutes, like a minute after I walked in, a bomb fell in the garden that I just walked through. And I'm still like one of the ones that had like a luckier experience. People in Gaza since then and today to the present have been suffering even more. Like if your whole home is bombed while you're in it, like we were lucky not to be in our home when it was bombed. So many people have had their homes bombed just while they're in them. And closing thoughts, I think ultimately that needs to stop. This killing and murder needs to stop. I don't want to keep looking at my phone and seeing messages or posts, hearing that my great aunts, 3 of them, were shot by Israeli troops in their home 3 weeks ago. My mother's cousin, a 14-year-old boy, had gone to just collect bread with his family, shot by an Israeli sniper or a quadcopter. I mean, there's technologies that are being applied right now when it comes to autonomous weapons that's actually really scary in that sense as well. So ultimately, we need this to end. Israel needs to be brought to task and stop what it is doing by the influence of the powers around it. It seems like the current British government has started taking some positive steps in that respect, like saying that they would not block the ICC arrest warrant. Whether they'd actually act and arrest an Israeli official, if they, like Netanyahu or the defense minister, is a different story. But yeah, we need more states to take those steps to stop Israeli impunity, end this genocide, and then from there end the occupation for freedom and justice for all.
You can't but agree. I recognize your passion and pain, but also how resilient and articulate you are, which to me captures every Palestinian I've ever met. This combination of a deeply felt loss, but also being incredibly articulate and resilient. Thank you so much for coming on. This has been Warrior Nation. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. We want to reach as many listeners as possible, so whatever platform you're hearing this on, please pop us a 5-star rating. Apparently it really helps in terms of spreading the word. You can follow us on Twitter or Instagram on @ForcesWatch. See you next time. If you enjoy what we produce and would like to support us to make more of it, then you can help us keep making Warrior Nation for as little as £2 a month via our Patreon, or you can support us through our donation page. And if you'd like to keep up to date with our work, you can sign up for our free monthly newsletter.